So good morning. Like he said, my name is Quintessence. I'm a developer advocate for Logs.io, which basically means I'm what's called, in my head anyway, a recovering SRE. All the good stuff, no on-call, best job ever. Before I get started, since it is early in the morning, everyone's kind of waking up, we're going to, in the theme of being sensory friendly, does anyone want to stand up and give a quick little stretch, kind of like this? Not joking. Yeah? Fantastic. How many of y'all did not realize how much tension you had in your shoulders just now? Yeah. So to the point of tension, we kind of get ourselves when we're trying to monitor things. We also get really tense, right? We start to want to know things like our status page and tickets and Slack, and it just rapidly becomes somewhat nightmarish, right? Because we just hook everything into everything, and then we just find ourselves just rapidly inundated with all these alerts, and then we can't keep track of them all, right? And when you're working at a startup, especially, at least in my experience having worked at startups, you kind of fall into this trap because you're either inheriting or instantiating an unknown. And so because it's unknown, you're trying to compensate for that by making it very known. Unfortunately, this means that you're kind of getting yourself into this position where when you're making it very known with all of the volume and maybe without keeping things relative to each other, making it only as loud as it needs to be, you might find yourself in a situation where you're like, okay, I don't know what's relevant or not, everything's loud, and now I'm not actually bringing anything in, so I'll just start turning things off, which is actually a very common practice, right? I mean, how many people have to mute or close Slack? Show of hands. Yeah. Or, you have PagerDuty on your phone or VictorOps or whomever you guys are using. And as you start turning systems off, right, you get the quiet again. So maybe you can focus on, say, building out Kubernetes or whatever your main job goal is. But then because you know it's only quiet because you've kind of forced it to be quiet, you're not actually calmer, right? You don't trust the silence. It actually makes you more hypervigilant because it's just accidentally quiet because you told it to shut up. So we need to find a happy medium where our alerts aren't bothering us all the time. But when they are bothering us, we know that we can pay attention to them, that we should pay attention to them, and that there are things we know we can do about them. And before we dive too deep into that, we need to understand why noise is so bad for us. Because if you think about it, we're not actually wired for noise, are we? We're always taking data in, though. So how many of you have ever had to live with family, siblings, parents, significant others, any other living human? Okay. And how many of you have discovered that suddenly you are as knowledgeable about their stuff, say they like dogs or flowers or birds, and you suddenly find that you know about dogs or flowers or birds, and someone's asking a random question about a species of bird, and you're like, oh, such and such and such, why do I know this? It's because your brain is osmotically pulling in whatever videos they're playing or information that they're digesting kind of as your background radiation, right? Anyone ever experienced this where you're like, why do I know this? Right. So your brain's not actually quietly processing this information. Even when you're trying to focus, if you have something going on in your background, it's actively taking time and energy to pay attention to that too. Let's say that you're at work and you're sitting on your laptop in the command line doing the good stuff or however, and then Joe Developer walks up and says, hey, what's the Wi-Fi password? How much productivity do you think you lose? Spoiler. On average, and there was actually a study done at UC Irvine by Gloria Mark to this effect. So her goal was to see how much time people lost when they were interrupted. And the reason I give the example is because we're not talking about an interruption like the system is down and you're redirecting your focus to a new task. We're talking a brief interruption that you resolve quickly and then try to refocus your attention on your initial task. And the reason it takes so long is because not only do you have to refocus on the task again, your brain is trying to rewind and put itself back into the state it was in when it was interrupted. but you've already gone through a state change. So it kind of gets caught up in this kind of mess upstairs, right? So you're trying to refocus on, doing your command line shell scripting amazingness, and you're just like, okay, where was I? What line was I on? Why was I building this function this way? Or whatever you're doing. And it just takes 25 minutes to course correct. Now, there are ways that you can try and get around this, but none of them are particularly successful, right? So when you're getting interrupted, let's say you're getting interrupted a lot, right? Not only are you losing about 25 minutes per interruption, you're also losing a certain amount of quality, right? Because after a certain amount of time, especially, how many of you are into DevOps? Fair percentage, right? Right. And how many of you get caught in the situation where it's like, I don't know who to ask, I'll ask the DevOps person, insert random question. Okay, so people keep walking up and asking you stuff, which is great, because you're like, I'm awesome, I know things, I can answer questions, but now I've gone from being interrupted sporadically to basically multitasking all the time between these walk-ups and my regularly scheduled work. And so what ends up happening is you notice a degradation in quality of work. And this is something that actually at George Mason University they did with AP students to see what the quality loss was. And so what they did is they took the essay, and they had people grading essays on these AP tests. And they found that people, on average, dropped about a half a point just by being interrupted. So not only did they have to, get the 25 minutes back to refocus on what they were doing to take the test, they still lost half a point. So it didn't fully return to where it had been before. So, okay, what if you're doing repetitive tasks? So you can say, and I don't know how many of you know about AP tests in the US, but it's basically like college prep exams, right? So let's say instead of something complicated like a college prep exam, you're just doing something simple like Bart Simpson writing sentences on the chalkboard, right? Doing the same repetitive task over and over. And so they studied this as well at Michigan U, and they said, okay, so multitasking isn't great, quality loss is terrible, time loss is terrible. What happens if we interrupt people doing a simple task? And then they noticed that people had error rates go up. So it's not even just the quality loss where you're still kind of getting roughly the same thing that you were intending to get. You're also seeing a rise in errors, which, get blame happened for a reason. So when we're trying to get around all of this, this is why it's so important to make sure that the noise that we're getting in the form of alerts and other things that we're doing to help us be attentive to our systems are actually only interrupting us when necessary, right? Because we have all of these other problems that come with it announcing yet another problem. So now we need to say, okay, problems are problems. How do we fix it? So first off, we should know what our sources of noise are, right? Because, I did that little quick animation in the beginning, but you probably roughly know if you have things like your ticketing system or your wiki kind of plugged in. You need to know what's being plugged into everything. You need to know what's alerting what. For example, if you're using AWS or GCP or what have you, you know what you're alerting on in your networks or your volumes or anything else that you have running in your infrastructure. Same with your code bases. So after you know what's being alerted on, you can start learning to channel it into a productive workflow. So how do we do that? All right, so let's take a look at a really super simple chaos diagram over here. Right, you have the ticketing system, you have some sort of logging. It doesn't have to be Elastic, but it can be Elastic, right? Email, infrastructure, code base, Slack, PagerDuty, et cetera, and everything's chatting with each other, right? So you have all these notifications plugging into each other, and then there's you, the viewer, viewing them. But it's also important to sidestep and say, okay, this is all my system's noise. What about my own noise? Because I never make any noise, right? So flashing back, if you're losing about 25 minutes to every interruption, and then you have Twitter going off on your phone, it's probably not going to be a fun place to be. So it's important when you're, working, if you know that you want to have some dedicated time to focus, that you are mindful of any sort of plugins or notifications that you have going on with regards to social media, text messaging, et cetera, so that you can minimize your own noise, which, especially in the case of social media, not to assume, but to assume, you can probably mute that. It's not the same as muting Slack, where someone might be trying to get in touch with you for a work problem. Twitter, you can probably check later. It's probably not mission critical. The way to get around that, and less for Twitter and more for like families and friends and things like that with the text messaging, is to be able to communicate and set boundaries. And this goes for coworkers as well. If you want to be able to dedicate time to focus on building, bug fixing, anything, blog posting, whatever goes into your normal workflow. If you're like, okay, I know that I really need to focus right after lunch because I just get my second win then. So let's say that it's, 1 to 4 p.m., right? You know that. If you don't tell people that, they don't know that, right? If you want people to respect your boundaries, you have to tell people what those boundaries are. And that goes around being able to say, okay, this is what's critical. Hey, family, please don't ask me to pick up the milk before 5:05 p.m., which is roughly when I'm getting out, right? But if someone is, in trouble or in the hospital, please call me. So that way you know that the noise that's coming in from any personal sources during the day is actually a high priority noise, and everything else can wait till the end of the day. Similarly with coworkers, if Joe developer needs the Wi-Fi password and you have like a little note on your cubicle or open office plan, pick it, however you want to do it, right? To say, okay, focus time. Joe knows not to ask you for the Wi-Fi password. He can go to somebody else's desk and ask for that. And then you have your focus time, right? But going back to the main point, dealing with this stuff, right? So we're not necessarily always getting notified by friends, families, and coworkers. We do have a lot of concerns, especially with DevOps, infrastructure, and things that we need to keep track of. So let's get started on that. Insofar as noise that's coming from code bases and infrastructure, these are 4 high-level points to keep track of, right? You don't want any noise that is unreliable, or towards the last point, too reliable, right? If it's going off because it's going off just to hear itself beep, you probably don't need that noise. And you're going to mute it and perhaps cause yourself some problems. I don't know if you guys saw in the news, but that big Target breach, in their postmortem that they released, they said it was because they had so much noise in their infrastructure, people were muting things, and then the high priority alert got muted out with the rest, right? To the top 2, if something's going off and it doesn't actually need to go off, you're making a code-based change, and now the endpoint that it's checking no longer exists, for example, you can probably modify or delete that, right? So that it's not interrupting you unnecessarily, because that's not a real alert, right? It's not actionable. It's not indicating any legitimate problem. It's just a change in the state of your system. Once you start to categorize those types of things and kind of push them out, you also need to keep track of the noise that you actually want. So what's left, right? Depending on what you have configured, you might have different tracks of where that information needs to go. So for example, what was mentioned, I did infrastructure automation and things like that. So if an alert goes off that indicates something's up with a button loading on the login page or something, as a contrived example, that I don't need to know that. I'm not going to be touching that. Or if a bug comes through for like a UI design choice that needs to be made, again, I don't need to know that. It just, if it appears in my kind of orbit, it's just going to be noise that I can't take action on. So I probably shouldn't be getting notified about it, really. Similarly, I do need to be notified about anything that may be going on in the infrastructure so that I can take action on it. So while you're making your noise plans, make sure that you're keeping track of, if you guys have separated teams or if everybody's kind of master of all trades, that you're making sure that the people who are notified are the people who can actually take action on any particular item rather than just everybody, SOS style. You also need to make sure that it is as loud as it should be. Who's ever been woken up when they were on call at some obscene hour? Okay. Who's been woken up at some obscene hour for something that wasn't actionable and or important? it happens. So the way to stop it from happening is to say, okay, when you're going through the alerts that you or someone else has configured for you, you need to be able to say, okay, this should not be going off at a volume that wakes me up at 4 a.m. Maybe plug it into Slack so I can check it in the morning or some other way in my ticketing system so that wherever I go to look at things that have happened overnight that are not critical or breaking, so that I can check it in the morning and make sure that things are still going smooth. I don't need PagerDuty or VictorOps to alarm my phone. And if it is alarming my phone, I should change that real quick. And then I don't get woken up at 4 a.m. for a non-actionable and or unimportant alert. Similarly, if you find that you've missed an alert that's high priority that should be pinging your phone, you absolutely, and I know that you probably hate me a little for saying this, you absolutely should up the noise on that alert to wake you up. Gonna pick on Slack for a hot second. So I'm talking about how to streamline alerts and how to keep things really concise, but you need to make sure that just because things are concise that you're not losing amount of flexibility or resiliency. So I'm gonna pick on Slack because they're normally really, really resilient, right? I think this was the only major Slack outage I've ever witnessed, but we're using it as an example because it was 3 hours. I don't know if anyone was online during last summer and noticed the 3-hour Slack outage. So let's say you're at a startup and you say to yourself, tools are expensive. So I'm plugging all my alerts into Slack. How much trouble do you think you would be in if Slack had a 3-hour outage? Especially if you maybe had an outage at the same time, if all of your alerts were exclusively going through Slack and you could not change your alert endpoints. That probably sounds like a not so great scenario, right? You need to make sure that if you only have 1 or 2 alert mechanisms that you can change your endpoints. You also need to make sure that however you design your alert mechanisms and your monitoring mechanisms, that you can change them agilely, not to overuse the overuse term, because what can happen is you might find on reevaluating over time, not Slack or some other tool that you're using, you might find that it's more error prone than you realized it was, or that it's becoming more error prone than it used to be, especially if it's a third-party service that you don't have control over fixing. And if that's the case, you need to be able to migrate away from that pretty easily so that you can maintain the integrity of your sanity/job. And as you're maintaining your sanity, instead of getting anxious Squidward, who is wondering why he's not getting notified, you actually can say, okay, instead of being silent because I told my system to shut up, I'm getting silence because I've actually configured a system that only talks to me when it has something to say. And I think that's a really important thing. It knocks down the hypervigilance. It allows you to pay attention to things that are only relevant to what you want it to be relevant to. And it makes sure that when you get something, you know it's actionable. Keeping things actionable, and going back to what I mentioned in passing before, if you notice that alerts aren't actually valid anymore, and this goes to what I had mentioned with the false positive, false negative thing, but can be true broadly speaking, maybe code changed, right? Maybe whatever you're checking no longer exists. Maybe you did an infrastructure migration. There are tons of reasons why a formerly valid alert or system is no longer valid now. And if you don't want to set yourself up for a situation where every quarter you do a massive alert overhaul, who thinks that sounds like fun? The room is empty because you've all run away, right? So instead of doing it all at once like that, if you do it iteratively, maybe during every sprint or some other regularly occurring system, you actually can say, okay, here are a couple of alerts that went off this week. Yeah, I don't think we need those anymore, or we should change what it's doing. And now it's getting changed slowly over time, just like your code and infrastructure is changing slowly over time. And instead of setting yourself up for a massive time sink, you actually are setting yourself up for success where you can just keep things clean and moving along. For those of you who like to take pictures of slides, these are the source materials. Feel free, I'll leave it up for a hot second if anyone wants to take a picture of it. Reference studies, some extra links that just seem like they might be helpful. Slides are posted. They're also on my GitHub, which is just Quintessence on GitHub. All right. Thank you for listening. And do I have time for questions? Yes, there you are. You're right, it is dark over there. I'm like looking all over for you. Does anyone want to ask any other questions? No? Awesome. All right. Oh, wait. You're going to hate me. It depends. Because everything's heavily customized, right? So depending on how you have things setting up, if you know what you want your workflow to be, and maybe you can start to visualize this while I talk to you, right? Like, what do you check most often? Do you prefer things to be piped into? And before I get too deep into that, the question is, what is a best practice to handling that middle ground of things that shouldn't wake you up, but you still need to know? So if you can start to visualize in your head, what's my workflow today? Or what do I check first in the morning besides maybe email, right? Is it like, Jira or something, or is it Slack or Slack? Yeah. I didn't want to just assume Slack, but realistically, it's Slack. So if you have like a channel, though, for you/your team, you can plug alerts to go into that. That's a pretty quiet process, especially if you have your Slack notification preferences to be such that it doesn't do anything particularly noisy. And you can just check that in the morning and just check your unreads. Alternatively, or in addition, I suppose is a better way to say it, if you have a dedicated channel for this, not only can you have alerts plugged into that channel, you can tell humans to plug their notes into that channel as well. So instead of trying to find you or the appropriate person, you and whomever else is in that channel watching that channel all get visibility at the same time. So for this particular instance, that's how I would handle it. Yeah. Any other questions? Raise your hand noisily if you want to raise your hand noisily.
Yeah, like you were saying, it's so easy to say someone comes and kind of disturbs your work, and it's so easy to say, oh, just say no, or just put up your hand. And is there any other tricks you can come with? Because it's always hard for me, someone coming up and asking for assistance or anything.
So it depends. You guys are going to hate me by the end of this Q&A section. So the question is, how do you handle walk-ups? Because you can't just be like, stop right now. Props if you recognize that. I'm old. So when you have walk-ups, obviously you don't want to necessarily take the rude tactic and just put your hand in their face as much as you may want to, depending on your anxiety and rage level of the day. But you do need to somehow communicate with them. Depending on, and I kind of like, Drive, I mentioned this earlier, depending on your office layout, it might be good to do something passive, like having a D&D either like sign on your cubicle or like something that's visible if you have that fantastic open office plan style, like a little, I don't know, stick it thing, but something that's visible so that people can at least see and assess in their own mind. It's like, oh, this is a working human. And they can almost filter out based on just that gentle introduction into your environment, something that you're busy. Nothing is going to be 100%, right? Because of the Joe and Jane developers of the world who are walking up asking for Wi-Fi passwords, some will see your boundaries and be like, oh, this person doesn't want to be disturbed for a little bit, and be super courteous about that. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, they're going to be like, I'm important. And sometimes you just gotta work with it too, which maybe isn't the answer you want to hear, but in my opinion, riding the middle and having something passively introduced into your environment should be helpful. Oh no, we're all guilty. I mean, it's not like I'm necessarily the most assertive person either. I mean, I stand up here with a microphone, but I assure you, if I'm working at my desk and someone wants to know something, I am absolutely happy to help them. Yes.
You mentioned earlier about being able to switch out your endpoints for alerting.
Yes.
Do you have any recommendations on a good package to abstract that away so that you can do that easily, or is it something I just go through my code base and try to swap out that thing?
I mean, it depends on what you're writing in and how much you've already abstracted. I would do something, if you're talking about code level alerts as opposed to things with UIs where you can just select a tool that's flexible or not, obviously choose the tool that's flexible. When you're talking about code bases, I would recommend putting something, and this is going to get a bit kludgy because code is the most heavily customized part of the whole works. Abstract it out as top level as you can, because then you only have to change it in one place instead of hunting it down. So if you know you need to make a rapid change, I mean, an example, like in Cloud Foundry universe, a lot of things are stored in environmental variables. And I know that this is pretty common, but just to keep the example kind of static, right? If you know that you've stored something in an environmental variable for Cloud Foundry that you have it piping out somewhere, very easy environmental variable change to push something to production and say, nope, you're going over here now. And that will happen almost instantaneously. So you want something that will mimic that kind of workflow, whether it be an environmental variable, whether it be something public or private, or however you've set it up in your code base, depending on language and framework and a whole bunch of low-level details. That would get into a very deep conversation, but that's what I would do. Keep it as exposed to you as possible so that no one has to dig deep to understand why you've done the flip that you've done. Do we have time for more questions? Okay. Any more questions? I think we're good. All right, well, it was wonderful speaking with you, and I'll be around. Please feel free to hunt me down. I'm in purple. I like purple. Lovely to meet you.